Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Jeff Rock, and welcome to another D. Hilton Associates webinar. Today, we're going to be discussing a very important topic, which is pulling a lot of interest, of course, but what is the current state of diversity at the top level of credit unions? So we're going to be going into some of the research we've done recently about the C-suite diversity. So we have a lot of content to cover. We got a lot of data to go through, but first, I just want to do a couple of administrative items as everybody settles in. We will be recording this, so if you do miss a point, you can go to our website and get a recording of this webinar. And if you do have any questions through this process, please feel free to either use the chat box or the Q&A section. The questions and answers will come directly to us here. The chat box will also default to coming to us only, but you can use the drop down to switch it to all participants. If you catch anything or anything that you need to change, like I said, the recording will be posted on the website as we move forward. Joining me today, I have Hillary Miley. Hi, how are you, Hillary?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well. And we also have joining us for the first time in the booth, Dr. Rhodes. How are you?
Doing well. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Hillary. Take it away, Hillary.
Thank you, Jeff. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. Like Jeff said, today we'll be discussing the results of D. Hilton's first annual diversity survey. Obviously, this is an important topic right now, and we wanted to gather data on credit union trends, particularly among executives, and hopefully create a baseline that we can continue to measure over time. So thank you to everyone who participated in the survey and made this possible. First, a brief overview of the methodology. We sent the survey to all credit unions with 10 million in assets or more, which was 3,980 credit unions at the time of distribution. We received 302 credit union responses, which is an overall response rate of 7.6%. So what we wanted to gather with this survey is we wanted to find out what is the current state of diversity in executive credit union positions, especially in those top positions that are generally considered the C-suite. How have credit unions expanded top-level diversity in the past 20 years? And finally, what are credit unions' plans, if any, to implement greater executive diversity? Here's the breakdown of responses by asset size. The largest group were credit unions with less than 50 million in assets, which comprised 30.4% of the group, followed by credit unions with assets of 100 million to 499 million, which is 28.7%. This is pretty close to the total of credit unions with assets over 10 million. The only exception to our response rate compared to the industry is that we had a slightly higher response rate from credit unions that have 1 billion or more in assets. Here's the overall frequency of executive positions among our respondents. So throughout the webinar, we're going to focus on those top positions that most credit unions report having: financial, operations, lending, technology, HR, and marketing. So 57% of credit unions report having a financial executive, 45% have an operations executive, 42% have a lending executive, 30% have a technology executive, 30% have an HR executive, and then finally 25% have a marketing executive. So let's look at how that C-suite changes compared to asset size. So obviously, larger credit unions are more likely to have area-specific executives, as you can see here. Almost all credit unions with assets of 500 million or more have a financial executive, while only 18% of credit unions with assets of 50 million or less have one. So next, here are the rest of the C-suite. So we have HR executives, marketing executives, and operations. So same thing as the previous slide, we do see an increase among most of these positions as a credit union gets larger. The only exception, which is a very small difference, is for marketing executives. But I think overall that is because as credit unions get larger, typically that marketing function breaks into different specific areas, such as member experience and that sort of thing. All right. So let's dive into the diversity data. Across all executive positions at credit unions, the majority are white Caucasian at 84%. Only 5.2% of executives are Black African American, and 5.4% are Hispanic Latino, 3.1% are Asian. Less than 1% are Native American and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander or multiple races. So overall, that's only 16.3% of executives who aren't white. So what I want to do is, at a high level, how does the credit union industry compare to the greater financial services industry as well as all industries in the United States? So this right here is diversity by industry according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics for 2019. So this represents all employed persons age 16 or over. Obviously, it's not just executives, so there's a little bit of difference in comparison between our data and that data, but it still gives you a good idea of how it varies across different industries. So the entire finance and insurance industry has only slightly more diversity compared to credit union executives. So in that industry, we have 78.6% who are white. Again, so as classified by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the finance and insurance industry is comprised of several more specific categories, which are represented here. So credit unions fall into the saving institutions category, that second from the bottom one. And within that category, 84% of employed persons age 16 or over are white, 9.3% are Black or African American, 4.2% are Asian, and 15.1% are Hispanic Latino. So it actually is, from the white perspective, similar to our credit union executives, but where it starts to change is some of that minority representation. But you can see how overall within the industry, there isn't a huge amount of difference between those different categories. Okay, so here we have gender among all of our executives that responded. So let's look at what it tells us. So almost 53% of executives are female and 47.3% are male. So across all of the executives that we received data on, 641 were male, 741 were female, and one identified as other. So same thing as before, I wanted to look at what is the gender representation of D. Hilton credit union executives according to the survey compared to all industries. So overall, credit union executives have a similar representation according to gender compared to all employees in the finance and insurance industry. However, you will see later that there is a notable difference in gender representation among executives as credit unions increase in size. So overall, we look similar to the workforce, but it does change depending on size of the institution. And here is gender representation broken out into those very specific categories within the finance and insurance industry, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So among saving institutions and credit unions, 67.5% are female, the highest among the 5 categories in the industry. So it is actually higher than what our credit union executive representation is, and the highest for all of the industry. So finally, how do credit union CEOs compare to CEOs in the Fortune 500? We are much better. So 2020 did see a record number of female CEOs among the Fortune 500, a whopping 37, which represents only 7.4% of the CEOs. So compared to credit unions, we have 37.2% of CEOs who are female. Now, of course, kind of how I mentioned before, among large credit unions with assets over 1 billion, we do drop a little bit in gender diversity. So among that asset category of 1 billion plus, only 24% of CEOs are female. But overall, we are doing okay when it comes to gender diversity among CEOs. Okay, next, let's look at the overall age distribution of our survey respondents. So among all executives, almost 80% are age 41 through 64, followed by 14.4% who are age 40 and under. Only 6.7 of all executives are over 65. As with gender, we do see differences in age representation across asset groups and across specific positions, which we'll discuss a little bit later. What does educational attainment look like for credit union executives? So just under half have bachelor's degrees, while 21.1% have a master's or higher. Almost 20% have a high school diploma or GED. As one would expect, this varies among the different positions, particularly those like financial executives, CEOs, HR, and general counsel. So educational attainment has changed significantly over the past 80 years, as you can see by this chart. This is from the United States Census. So in 1940, only 4.6% of the population had 4 years or more of college. And then that is now compared in 2019 to 36%. So the reason I included this is just to see, there's obviously a difference in educational attainment depending on age of the executive, and a lot of other different factors, but this is just kind of overall how this statistic has changed over time in the United States. All right, let's get into how diversity varies across different executive positions. So here is the president CEO position by race ethnicity. So almost 90% of credit union CEOs are white, and only 4.2% are Black African American, 3.5% are Hispanic Latino, and then 2.1% are Asian or Asian American, and then 1% is multiple races. So it is heavily represented by white Caucasian executives. And then this is how race of the president CEO varies across the different asset groups. Overall, asset size doesn't appear to have that much influence on race among president CEOs. So across all of the asset groups, at least 80% of CEOs are white, with all except those in the 599 million group, which reports closer to, to the 1 billion plus, which reports closer to 90%. All right, so here are those individual C-suite positions by race ethnicity. So we can see technology executives have slightly more racial diversity compared to finance or lending executives. So 11% of tech executives are Hispanic Latino and 7.7% are Asian America, which among financial and lending, we see those different races that are non-white are less at 5% or less than 5% for all of them. HR executives, they have the highest percentage of Black African American representation compared to the other positions, with 8.6% of executives. So a smaller amount, 8.5% of marketing executives are Hispanic Latino, and 4.2% are Asian American. When looking at race across executive positions, we wanted to find out if there was more racial diversity among the executive team if the president CEO was a minority race. And yes, we did find that that is true. There is greater representation of Black African American executives, Hispanic executives, and Asian American executives in executive teams among non-white CEOs. I know that's a lot of different data points, but we'll try to keep you following along. So for CEOs who are not white, 28% have one or more executive in their executive team who is Black African American, compared to only 12.9% among white CEOs. For white CEOs, only 7.8% have one or more executive that is Hispanic, compared to 28.1% of non-white CEOs. So you can see there's a pretty big difference when you compare white CEOs to racial minority CEOs. And it clearly indicates that there is likely opportunity if you want to pursue diversity in your organization. It does come from the top down. Now, I would love to be able to examine executive diversity among president CEOs as well as the executive C-suite compared to a credit union board diversity, but we haven't yet figured out how exactly we can tackle that data collection. But hopefully, that's something that we can look forward to in the future.
Yeah, I think we've seen an interesting perspective when it comes down to the differences of boards. You usually do see a little bit more diversity at that level. Do you agree on that?
Yeah, I would. There's definitely, I mean, I would assume just from anecdotal experience that a board that is more diverse typically has a credit union executive team that is also more diverse. All right, so let's look at positions by gender. So this one is interesting, and I would be curious to know if this is what any of you guys expected or if you're surprised by some of these. The executive positions that are historically more likely to be female, so human resources, marketing, is still the case currently. Almost 90% of HR executives and 68% of marketing executives are women. Operations executives are also overwhelmingly female at 70.4%. So, among financial and lending executives, we see the most equality between those two specialties. However, that equality does decrease as a credit union gets larger, which we will look at in a moment. Overall, technology executives have the highest racial diversity, but is one of the lowest for gender diversity. And they also don't see much change in that gender diversity as credit union assets change. Among CEOs, there's a notable difference in representation of women as a credit union gets larger. So, smaller credit unions are much more likely to have female CEOs, while less than a quarter of credit unions in both the 100 to 499 million and 1 billion plus groups have female CEOs. Female presidents who are younger, 40 and under, as well as older, 65 plus, tend to drop off at highest asset size levels. That could be perhaps due to motherhood or retirement, but age patterns of females in the highest asset group vary quite a bit based on the position. So this is what I was saying earlier about how that difference in C-suite positions by gender as a credit union gets larger. So because it gets pretty unwieldy and it's quite a lot of data, we used larger asset segments to look at the different C-suite positions just to keep things a little bit simpler. You can see how gender diversity decreases among financial and lending executives as a credit union gets larger. So, those are the two groups that we did see a fair amount of equality between the genders overall, but you can see that really does depend on the credit union's asset size. Only 29% of executives in credit unions, lending executives at credit unions 1 billion and over are female, compared to for credit unions that are less than 1 billion, it's over 50%. Among credit unions with 1 billion or more in assets, only 35% of financial executives are female. And you can see that that's also a pretty big drop compared to those credit unions that have less than 1 billion in assets. So overall, what this tells us is while we can be excited that there's gender diversity overall in the C-suite, it is a little bit misleading in that it is not even across the different asset sizes. And like I mentioned before, for that technology executive, you can see there's not really much difference in how gender equality changes when the asset sizes change. So for both less than 1 billion and 1 billion and over institutions, there's a pretty low representation of female executives in that technology position. All right, next, let's look at HR, marketing, and operations. So asset size doesn't seem to affect representation for HR execs, but it does for both marketing and operations. These positions both have more equal representation at the over 1 billion mark than some of the other C-suite positions. So that's good, but you can see it still experiences that same drop. It's just less noticeable because it still maintains pretty good equality in those larger institutions. Jeff, were you surprised by any of these positions?
Absolutely. It's very unique to see how it all kind of pieces together, especially when it moves to there. But it's interesting to see that the HR side is a little bit more balanced on certain aspects. I kind of expected to see the technology field be on the outside, but it's good to see that the HR field is right in the right balance there. Well, getting closer to the right balance.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of those ones that like you would obviously, I mean, it would be ideal if there was more equality in that position, the other direction. That's one of the ones the only one where we really don't see that. But
yeah, and it's interesting to see that, like we talked about before, where the asset ranges really change the perspective and the diversity there. We're seeing a kind of a similar ratio even as we move up in the asset sizes. So it is unique. That's an interesting perspective.
Yeah. So we looked at the same question that we did with race is, does the gender of the president CEO affect the overall gender diversity among the C-suite? And same with racial diversity. It does affect it. There's greater representation of females among the C-suite of credit unions who have female CEOs. So for female CEOs, 66.8% have at least one or more female executive compared to 53.1% of male CEOs. Now, keep in mind these percentages aren't the percentages of total executives by gender, but rather the percent of credit unions that have one or more executive. That would be obviously interesting to look at as well. Now, one positive that we can take away from this that I think we saw overall as well is that there is less difference in this than there is compared to racial diversity, but it clearly does indicate that, the diversity of the CEO does affect the rest of the credit union. Now, here it is split up by different asset groups. So asset size definitely has a similar effect. Now, this, of course, isn't surprising because we just looked at the gender representation changes among the different positions as a credit union gets larger. So obviously, you can see where you have greater representation in those smaller asset size groups, and then it decreases as we, or at least moves closer to equality as we gain assets.
We got a quick question here for you. And I don't know if you have this data teased out in this. So if we have to circle back around on that, that's perfectly okay. They're curious about how many organizations are there in the 1 billion or greater asset size in comparison to the less than 1 billion asset size. Do we have that teased out in the data anywhere as far as what our sample size goes based off asset size?
Our sample size or the industry?
Great question.
I believe...
It says there's 342 for 1 billion and over
in the industry or in our
sample size. They're looking for sample size in this case.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's the whole 10 million plus.
Yeah.
Yeah. I hope that answers their question.
So how many did we have in the 1 billion or greater asset size in comparison to the less than 1 billion? Did you have that? No. Okay. Not teased out. We'll have to circle around on that. We'll have that as the data behind the scenes, but not in the slides into the data that we have here right now. So we'll get back to you on that one and let you know what the sample sizes kind of look like.
Yeah. So, I mean, 1 billion plus is a significantly smaller group compared to less than 1 billion. Because obviously we know that the majority of credit unions are skewed to that lower asset size group. So, I mean, it would be like 3,400, I think, something like that in the industry of 10 million plus, of course. Okay, so let's look at position by age group. I just want to point out that Dina was giving me a hard time about this graphic. I don't want anyone to think that, this is representative of everyone here. I'm just trying to show trajectory of life.
Is it okay to say I feel like the one on the end there on the right?
I mean, I think a lot of us probably do at the end of 2020.
This year, I spent an entire year in this year one day. That was it. So I really do feel like that person on the right end there.
Mm-hmm. All right, so here's what age group looks like among president CEOs. So 84% are within that 41 to 64 group, while 10% are over age 65, and 6.1% are under age 40, which this, I think everyone would probably assume that, this is what you would expect. I was not surprised by this distribution. Now, we do see a difference in age representation among CEOs across the different asset size groups. So larger credit unions with 1 billion or more in assets are slightly more likely to have a CEO that is age 65 and older. Smaller credit unions, particularly those in the 50 to 99 million in asset group, are more likely to have a younger CEO under the age of 40. Now, this is probably not surprising to anyone, as we generally do find that CEOs at larger credit unions are more likely to be older because of their experience level, and typically, their expansive knowledge of different areas, especially as, larger credit unions have more very specific areas that are, responsible for different executives. So here we have age distribution across the entire C-suite. So operations executives have the highest representation of under 40, with almost a quarter of their executives. Among the other C-suite positions, including the CEO, there's pretty similar representation among the age groups. We do see more young CEOs in marketing, technology, and then finance as well, which I actually was a little bit surprised by that. And then, like I said, CEOs have the largest representation of that over 65 group, followed by HR executives, where almost 7% are over 65, and then operations executives that have 6% that are over 65. So operations executives kind of have a little bit more distribution on those end groups than we see for some of the other executives. All right, so let's move on to educational attainment among C-suite. So this is the educational attainment among president and CEOs. So 51.2% have a bachelor's degree, followed by 30% that have a master's degree or higher, and then 8.8% have a high school diploma or GED. And we do see a difference in terms of educational attainment across different asset groups. Particularly, associate's degrees are mostly found among credit unions that have assets under 50 million. We see an increase in master's degrees as well as professional degrees as credit unions get larger. The bachelor's degree is, of course, the most popular among most of the asset groups, but for credit unions with $1 billion or more in assets, there's a similar percentage of CEOs with a bachelor's compared to those with a master's degree.
I think this will be interesting to watch over time as these kind of level out, because in the industry now, especially beyond the compensation side, more and more I'm seeing people say, you know what, we don't care too much about the education level. It's okay. Let's remove that from the requirements. It's not taking hold of the entire market just yet. But I'm going to be curious how that works out, because you have like the Tesla, Elon, Ernst & Young, Google saying, I don't know if this translates down to the exec or up to the executive level, but they say, you know what, scratch that requirement off of there. So it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out in the long term.
Mm-hmm. So here's educational attainment across the entire C-suite. So CEOs, finance executives, and HR executives report the highest instance of master's degrees, while operations execs are the most likely of the positions to have a high school diploma. About half or slightly less of all positions have a bachelor's degree. But you can see it really does vary across the different specialties. Particularly marketing, lending have similar degree educational attainment levels compared to HR and finance, which are much more highly skewed towards those higher degrees, which I actually was surprised at the level of masters among HR executives.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, we work with many HR executives who have extensive education, but I wasn't sure that it was that high across the whole industry.
Yeah, that does surprise me as well. In general, I think that the common mindset would be, oh, HR. You just learn that as you go. But getting an actual advanced degree in HR, that is a surprising statistic to me.
And it could be a reflection of, HR has changed a lot over time. It's much more we focus on culture, we focus on employee engagement. And so
Much
there
more
is
fuzzy.
quite a bit of, education that comes to those. So that could be part of it as well.
Mm-hmm.
So overall, what actions are credit unions taking to increase diversity at their organization and among their C-suite? So we asked credit unions over the past 20 years, to what extent has your credit union expanded diversity among its top level executives? So first, let's look at racial and ethnic diversity. So slightly under 50% say they've expanded their diversity among race, at least to some extent. But then more than half says, oh, I'm sorry, I need to go to the next slide. More than half say they haven't expanded diversity among their top level executives at all. So that was definitely interesting. It is clear that more expansion among gender diversity has happened rather than race. So for credit unions, 80% say they've expanded gender diversity, at least to some extent, and only 21% said none, which obviously is 30% less when you look at the racial ethnic diversity. So here we look at, how have credit unions say that they've expanded diversity in the last 20 years, according to the race of their president and CEO. So this one is pretty stark between the race of the president and CEO. So you can see that among those CEOs who are Black, African American, Hispanic, Latino, they're much more likely to say that they've expanded racial diversity compared to white CEOs. For white CEOs, same as the overall distribution, it's about half. So slightly less than half, 48% say they've expanded it at least to some extent. And then 52% say they haven't expanded it at all. So how has gender diversity expansion been affected by the gender of president CEO? So as we saw before, male president CEOs are significantly more likely to believe that their credit union has expanded gender diversity compared to female president CEOs. So that I did find interesting. Is that because they have expanded gender diversity, or the perception that they have has increased?
And that's definitely hard to kind of pin down as far as what's actually going on and driving those numbers, because that is a pretty stark difference.
Mm-hmm. And I think that that's one of the reasons that we want to implement this survey on a regular basis, like we do some of our other research instruments, because I would be interested to see, as we do a survey over time, we'd be able to actually see how does it compare to what they're saying and what's actually happening.
Mm-hmm. Are the actions actually matching the words? Okay, we want diversity, we want inclusion. Is it actually coming through? Is it actually happening? So I look forward to seeing that as well.
Yeah.
These are very interesting. You have a lot of good data going on here, Hillary.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty good. And we do plan on writing a white paper about this, because there is a lot that we are not including in this webinar, because I would like everyone to stay awake. I mean, it's very interesting, but you can get into really deep data. So we do plan on publishing a much more in-depth look at all of this, especially because, right now we're focusing on those top 5 executive C-suite positions, or 6 rather, and we can go a lot further than that in, all those other executive positions that credit unions indicated that they do have. Okay, so have credit unions expanded their diversity? How does it change according to asset group? So there are statistically significant differences in perception of past gender and whether or not a credit union says they've expanded their gender diversity across the different asset groups. So among those 2 lowest asset groups, they have significantly lower likelihood to say that they've expanded gender diversity. You can see we have those mean scores, and this is on a scale of 5. So 2.58 and 2.77 for those 2 smaller groups. And then among, for example, 1 billion plus, we've got 89% who say they have expanded to some extent. And then same for 500 to 999 is 95%. And then 100 to 499 is 91%. So you can see there is definitely a stark difference in whether or not a credit union has expanded their gender diversity or feel that they have according to asset size. And, I would assume based on this, my first assumption looking at these numbers is, like with a lot of things, we see differences among those smaller credit unions because one, smaller credit unions have fewer executives. So there's less opportunity to implement diversity. Not that that's a reason not to, but, and then also just the resources, what does their HR look like? How do they have the resources to focus on those kinds of initiatives? I mean, that could vary as well.
So Hillary, this goes back to the question that we had before. And I know each question has a little bit of a different end involved in it, but would you say that this is pretty prototypical for the responses that we had as far as, you see asset size end of 67 as far as 50 million and below? Is that going to be pretty much the same for the rest of this information that we have? Would that be a good decision, or can we make that statement?
For the most part, obviously, not all respondents answered every question. Some answered all, some answered a few. So those in values are a little bit lower than the total in values for each of those asset groups. Because we did have fewer people answer this question compared to some of the other ones.
Gotcha. But, so we're looking pretty close to saying that we, as a billion and over, we had at minimum 44 responses on a lot of these things.
Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So to that question previously, that's kind of the breakdown. We'll get that information to you because obviously we have it broken down. We just don't have it out on hand right this moment. That shows in our sample size how many the division between over a billion and under a billion goes.
It's almost 100%. So it's 44, and then we had 46 that were a billion and over.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
And like I said when we started, so when you look at those individual asset groups, our representation of responses among those asset groups is very close to the actual amount within the industry, of course, within that 10 million plus group, with the exception of 1 billion over, which we had a higher response. All right, so let's look at what credit unions say they've done for expanding diversity among age and education. Obviously, I think these are probably a little bit easier. So 84% of credit unions say that they've expanded age diversity, at least to some extent. And then only 16.4% said none. And then educational diversity, 80% said they've expanded it, at least to some extent. I mean, I think both of these are great. Obviously, we see the workforce has changed a lot over time. Obviously, people don't retire as early as they may have in the past. So I think that contributes to age diversity as well. And same with education, like that one slide I showed from 1940 to 2019, educational attainment has changed quite a bit over the past few years and over the last 80 years. So that contributes as well.
And I like that you took the time to actually change the color of the title there. That's quality stuff. Right? That's attention to detail.
All right. So next we asked credit unions, do you have a formal initiative or do you plan to implement a greater diversity initiative among your top level executives? This I was surprised by. I was surprised by how many credit unions said that they're fine. So 52% overall said they're fine how they currently are. 22% said they'd like to have one. And then 18% are currently developing one, but only 8% have some kind of formal initiative or plan in place. And this does vary by asset size, as we will see right now. So larger credit unions are much more likely to either be working to develop a formal plan or already have one in place. Credit unions that are 1 billion plus, 13% of them say they already have one in place. And then almost 50% are currently developing one. So you can really see how that changes. And I think that there's probably many reasons for this, but certainly one is, like I said, smaller credit unions do have fewer resources, and obviously their HR is responsible for so many things. So it can be tough to put that kind of formal plan in place, but it's certainly, something that a lot of credit unions are trying to work towards.
Mm-hmm. And I think in the past, a lot of organizations, not just in the credit union industry, were kind of fearful of running these analysis, looking in the data and saying, "Oh, hey, we have a problem here," because they were kind of scared of it to be raising a flag that they were doing something wrong. But in this case, it really has the mindset has changed, and they say, "Okay, it is important that we do see, hey, maybe there are some discrepancies. We need a plan in place. We need a formal process to make sure that we're not unwittingly." Kind of going the wrong direction in some of this stuff.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that is all the slides that I have for y'all today. So let's move on to questions. So based on what you've seen, do you have any questions about the survey, about any of the data that we've presented, or anything else?
So we do have a couple of questions, and while we're going through these, please feel free to chat in. We'll get some more going. This one we may not be able to answer off the top of the cuff here, but any data that shows the age of CEOs and how that reflects diversity in the C-suite?
Yeah, so that actually is something that we did run analysis on, but obviously that gets pretty detailed and in depth. So we didn't include it in the webinar, but we do plan on including kind of that deep dive in the white paper that we are going to publish.
Fantastic. So keep an eye out for the white paper when it comes around. Is that going to be posted on our website, or is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So we'll post it on the website. We'll probably send out an email blast letting everyone know that it's available. And then obviously for anyone who attended today, feel free to email me and, inquire when it's going to be available. It won't be in the next 2 weeks. So don't ask me then.
We have a little bit of time to deal. As far as age of CEOs in the credit union industry versus other industries, do we have any resources that we can use to see perhaps what the difference would be? That sounds to me like a very specialized survey. I don't think we've done anything as far as that goes, but I'll leave it to the experts on this one.
So we haven't, but it's certainly, I think, probably possible. The Bureau of Labor Statistics does publish age data by industry. The only difference with that is similar to kind of those slides I had at the beginning comparing industry and gender and racial diversity is it's all employed person 16 and over. So from a CEO perspective, it isn't comparable, but it is certainly something that we can look into to try to figure out, how we do look compared to other industries.
Mm-hmm. And I think we might be able to tap into some of our recruiting practices as well to see how it kind of where other executives are pulling from, things along that line. So we got a bunch of good reference points that we can pull in there. That was definitely something for the future, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
Thinking of the future, is there any plan to include LGBTQ as part of the future diversity surveys?
That's a good question. One of the reasons we didn't tackle it was obviously because, we're asking human resources to work with the executive team to provide this information. And so, we didn't want to
press too hard.
We didn't want to make people have to share any of that information.
Mm-hmm.
I think, if we were able to do an anonymous survey to individual executives, then if people wanted to include that, they could. But I don't know that at this time it's something that we would be looking to collect.
Okay. Any statistics related to membership demographics compared to the makeup of the C-suite?
That would certainly be very interesting to look at. We don't have that kind of data. Now, obviously, in our member survey peer database, we have quite a bit of membership demographic data. So that would just be a matter of looking at, okay, so what do we have with the credit union industry? And then we would have to be able to compare it to the individual executive team. And right now, in this data, we wanted to make sure that this survey was anonymous. So we don't have any information on what credit union is what. So we can't necessarily connect that, but I'm sure there is a relationship between, what the C-suite looks like. It's probably also highly affected by the demographic makeup of the area that they're in, or, if they're community versus seg and that sort of thing.
And someone did mention in the chat that Coopera and CUNA might have that data as well. So that might be another resource to kind of look into if you'd like to dig deeper into that as well. So for the 51% of credit unions that don't have a formal initiative or plan to implement a diversity plan, is it likely that they will not be updating their hiring practices either? I think that kind of goes hand in hand with the fact of if they don't know there's a problem, they're not going to be updating their hiring practices because why change in their mind what's working?
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah, that's a hard thing to, if you don't know there's a fire going on, or if there's a problem, or if there's a particular trend of stereotyping, even when you don't, or everybody has a particular bias. So if that bias isn't brought to the forefront, I don't think you're going to be able to implement. What gets measured gets changed, I think, in that case.
Yeah, and research has shown that organizations who actually take specific action have more success addressing diversity than those who just say, we'll just, try to hire better. You have to actually work towards it.
Yeah. And then you get the kind of foolhardy mindsets in some cases like, oh, we're going to have a quota. Wildly wrong. Definitely the wrong way to approach that. But the other thing is a lot of these statistics, especially when it comes to HR, are pretty hard to balance because in some cases, if you're in an area where the population is different, if your credit union isn't kind of matching that population, that's where the problem is. So if you do have a credit union that's matching the population, you might not be biased, even though your numbers show, okay, we're mostly white or we're mostly this or mostly that. It is something to continue to focus on, of course, because it does bring up other problems and other issues. But there's a lot of layers to the data that you do need to go into. But one way to get there is to start looking at that data, start having that conversation and see if it is a problem. In most cases, a lot of people aren't looking that intently at it or haven't been in the past. But as this conversation goes on and it becomes a little bit more something that people want to talk about, we're starting to see better ways to accomplish that.
Yeah.
Let's see. We do have a couple more questions. What is being done to educate HR professionals in the credit union industry about the type of data and best practices for diverse recruiting? Oh, that's a good question. There's so many little pieces that come into that. And I think it really boils down to seeing more of this data and understanding that how important it is. I can't remember a conversation that I've had with the board recently that hasn't talked about we need to make sure that we are looking at a diverse candidate. Here internally, I can only speak to what we do here. And we've got individuals, our recruiters, that have been certified to be able to make sure that they're looking and asking the right questions and looking at the right candidates and understanding that it's much more than just that person there or that name on it. It's looking at or actually just looking at the name or looking at the person kind of deal, where they're not letting their bias guide their decisions, being able to who we put in front of the board or the executives to be able to look at an executive position. So there are resources out there to help educate recruiters, to help educate HR individuals. You can actually become certified in these pieces. And kind of that's the best thing to go about is education and understanding, well, when you look at this data, what does it mean? What does it mean for the credit union industry? And what does it mean for you as a human being? I don't know. Did I ramble on that one?
No, that's definitely the case. I mean, I know internally our recruiting team has been working really hard to make sure that they're up to date on the latest information and that they're really pursuing that learning because obviously, if we're placing executives at credit unions all over the country, then we are contributing to this. So it is something that we as well need to focus on, and we do.
And you have to have a process. You have to have a policy, procedure, and process in place because, like we said before, what gets measured gets done. And if you're not seeing some of the results of the recruiting practices, there is no awareness of that. So the more that companies are putting forth the effort to do these diversity studies, to look at, are we being actually inclusive or are we just saying we're being inclusive is step one. And I think we're slowly but surely accomplishing step one because like I said, these conversations are happening much, much more often now.
Yeah. And that's, why we want to put this in place as a regular research instrument, because we will be able to then gather data on how the industry is changing over time.
So when we do release the white paper, are there going to be any strategies included for closing some of these gaps, like recruiting efforts, things that they need to improve in different areas, things along that nature? What do you think?
I don't know that that's something that we would include in this particular white paper. What we're looking for is we are just trying to publish the data. Now, obviously, part of that process will be collaborating with our recruiting group. So don't hold me to that. We might come up with, some pretty interesting stuff to include.
Do you think that CEOs understand the demographics of the future? Will credit unions be prepared?
That is a great question.
Let's solve world peace and then we'll get to this one.
I also think, like I was saying before, one of the things that I would be interested to collect is, what a board looks like compared to what their executive team looks like, what that relationship is. Because I think it would require both CEOs and the board to be on the same page and to have that same level of commitment and knowledge for it to really, truly become a part of a credit union.
And Victor, I don't mean to call you out on this one, but if you switch to your chat, you're bringing up some great points. If you want to put that to all participants rather than all panelists, I think sharing some of your insights on that would be a good opportunity. If you don't want to do that, by all means, don't have to, but that way everybody can actually see what we're doing. All right. What is your approach and philosophy to help create more diversity in the upper level asset credit union CEO group? Wow, that's a great question as far as that goes. When it comes down to it, the approach and philosophy is education, understanding, and knowing that there is something going on. You have to have those conversations with the recruiting team. When you work with a third-party recruiter like what we have here, making sure that you're dealing with individuals that have that diversity certification or understand that they are taking that into forefront, their forethought to make sure that it is going along the way that it needs to be going along. There's no one set right, correct answer when it comes down to this. It's just an understanding of you have to have the education. You have to understand what's going on internally to know that there is some kind of issue. And then from there, putting forward the policy, procedure, and process. Something other than, of course, quotas or anything along that line, but making sure that internally you have education, internally you have certifications, or you've expanded the knowledge that there is a necessity to look at things from a different perspective. And if you're looking at third parties, make sure that they say and can show that, hey, we've got certifications in this. We've got the education. We've got the backing. We're going to make sure we're presenting you with qualified, diverse candidates, both in race and gender. And we're going to make sure that you understand on the other end that this is important. Don't look at it as just X, Y, and Z. We need to look at it from the skills, the attributes, and the capabilities of that person, not any other piece of that. That's a very hard question to answer, unfortunately. But when it comes down to it, awareness is going to be the biggest key. And then moving forward from there, you have to reverse engineer to make sure that the partners you're working with, as well as the internal teams, have that knowledge to understand how they could possibly be letting their bias fall into place. The other side is making sure that the board, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, the diversity of the board is extremely important in this case, because a lot of times when it comes down to the CEOs, the boards are going to be making those decisions. And having a diverse board that comes from a different perspective, multiple different perspectives, very important to have there.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Any other questions?
Scanning through a couple here. Let me see if we've got any that we haven't gone over yet. Great questions, guys. This is I figured this was going to be one that we had a lot of good questions for, because we have a ton of data and it's a very, very touchy subject in some cases, so it's something that the conversations need to continue on and really understand what we can do and move forward from there. So far, I think we have covered all of this. If we've missed any questions, we'll go back through. There's a lot of chat going on, so I'm trying to surf through some of these as they're coming in. Okay, we'll take care of a couple last administrative things. If we've missed any questions, we'll circle back around, or if you have another question that you want to pop in, go right ahead. There is going to be a recording of this webinar posted onto our website. The following, and in probably about 2 or 3 days, you'll receive a follow-up email that will have a survey for us, letting us know how we did and things we could do better or change, or topics you'd like to talk about. There will also be a opportunity. I believe Hillary's information will be in that email. So if you'd like a copy of the slides, she'll be able to take care of that for you and send that out to you. Doesn't look like we have any further questions on that. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating. We really do sincerely appreciate you taking the time to join us on a very important topic. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We're always happy to talk about what we can. We may not have all the answers right on the spot, but by gosh, we'll get you something good on the other side of it. So for the time being, thank you so much for joining us. We'll catch you again on the next one.
Thanks, everyone.